ultimately the biggest problem became, or the at least what I thought became the biggest problem, was like, how do you build the network in a cost-effective way, right? Because the typical model, if you're an AT&T or a Verizon or a T-Mobile or whatever, is that you pay for all the hardware, you pay for all the real estate, you pay for the power, the backhaul, and it's expensive. You spend billions and billions of dollars building networks. And then you have to recoup those costs from subscribers or users, right? You could reward people for proving that they were creating network coverage. That was the start. Like, proof of coverage was really our light bulb moment. Was like, is there a way for these hotspots, as we ended up calling them, to like send wireless packets into the air that were encrypted in some way? And if something else could receive them and decrypt them, then that was like proof that there was, a network there in the physical world.
Amir, thank you so much for joining me today. Super excited to have you here on the podcast. And big fan of ultimately what you're building with the Helium Network. I think we were talking just a little bit prior to the podcast, and I think you guys are trying something new and something that is different. And with that comes all sorts of challenges, from building your own infrastructure to have since kind of migrating to the Solana network, to even coming up with some unique ways to incentivize the demand, to kind of people funding what you're building. So really looking forward to the conversation, and a big admirer of what you and the team have ultimately built at the Helium Foundation.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
I would love, I think everybody kind of has a unique kind of point of view on the blockchain world and how they ultimately kind of fell into the rabbit hole. Could you just start with a little bit of your background? I think you kind of approach it from a little bit of a different and unique angle.
Very, very, very much so. My background is I came from the video game world. In college, I discovered Quake, and years and years and years ago. Before that, I'd played Doom a bunch, but Quake was the first like TCP/IP multiplayer game. This was like 1996. So I'm old. And so like that was really an eye-opening experience for me. The fact that you could like play against other people that weren't near you was like a ridiculous idea. And it happened a little bit with Doom, but it was all dial-up modems, and so it wasn't quite the same. And so I went very deeply down this rabbit hole with Quake, and I became a competitive gamer. I started to win competitions. I started to like get sponsored and play in these tournaments. And so it was definitely one of the first like Western world, like professional gamers. And that introduced me to a lot of, I think the best in the world at Quake and Quake 3 and Unreal Tournament at different times. And so I took this really seriously, and I just went nuts with it. But I think what was important or interesting about that was that I met a lot of interesting people, because back in those days, really the only people that had fast internet connections were either college students or people working at companies. And so I met this network of people and ended up working in the video game industry as a result of that. I worked on like Battlefield 1942 and like other games like that early on in my career. So it led me down this really interesting path, all as a result of like playing too much Quake in college. And so when one of the people I met on that journey was Sean Fanning, who was the founder of Napster and someone that I had heard of and admired. And that was sort of mid 2000s, and years later, like he started talking to me about, we should build a network for sensors. And I was like, I don't know anything about building networks or sensors or wireless technology really beyond, the sort of simple stuff. And then, that conversation sort of perpetuated for a while. Like we were talking about this for years, before we actually started to take it seriously. Like this notion of like, could we build a wireless network, that was designed for low power things? That was really the focus of what we were going for. Like we thought that, existing networks weren't well suited for sensors, basically, right? Like we had heard all this conversation about Internet of Things, low power sensor devices. I always remember that scene. There was that movie Twister, I think it was, where there was a scene where they just like unleash all these sensors and they like fly off into the tornadoes. And that was kind of the imagination at the time. This was like 2012, 2013. It was like, there should just be sensors everywhere sensing everything, right? And it would help with stuff like wildfires, and it would make sure that your food was fresh. It would make sure that drugs had been stored at the right temperature. And, like there was all these applications and use cases that people had in mind. but there wasn't really a network for that, right? You had cellular networks that were designed for high data usage stuff like phones, basically. But you didn't have any networks that were really designed for low power things. So that was the impetus for it all. And it wasn't until years after that we sort of ended up in the blockchain part of it. But the impetus was like, we saw a gap. We saw that there should be these like IoT low power wireless networks. And there wasn't one. And so we started a company trying to solve that problem. That was sort of how it all became.
A really cool background just on the gaming side too. I think I swam in college, and I find that competitive nature, kind of that drive, kind of wanting to win, is very helpful in your entrepreneurial journey as well.
I think so. I mean, it's definitely a thing that I've noticed is that a lot of founders come from competitive backgrounds of some kind. Like I was a serious soccer player. I was a competitive like esports guy. These days, I like to race cars. You know, like there's something innate about, you know, the need to like compete. And I think it comes from learning, I think, right? Like there's always a way to be better and faster and stronger. And, you know, and I think that curiosity is super important for startup people and especially founders. Like, are you curious about different ways that it could be done? And, I think that isn't an accident that you often find a lot of founders are competitive in some way.
I fully agree. And maybe to kind of continuing on like the startup journey and ultimately the idea maze that you guys went through, I think the early version of Helium had nothing to really do with the blockchain. And blockchain was kind of ultimately supplemental to kind of incentivize the network and build it out. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that journey of kind of starting what is now Helium and kind of some of the iterations that you went through in the early days before and kind of after kind of the blockchain and how you integrated it?
Yeah, there was a lot going on. I think we had the right idea at the start. So we started the company in 2013, and I think we had the right problem identified, which is that there should be a network for this kind of stuff. And we had a lot of entrepreneurial friends that were looking to start businesses in that space that would have taken advantage of a network like that. You know, they were building wireless sensor applications. I think one of the challenges is that we didn't have a good plan for how to actually deploy a network. So we spent a lot of time focused on the network protocol and the hardware and like all of these bits. But ultimately the biggest problem became, at least what I thought became the biggest problem was like, how do you build the network in a cost effective way? Right. Because the typical model, if you're an AT&T or a Verizon or a T-Mobile or whatever, is that you pay for all the hardware, you pay for all the real estate, you pay for the power, the backhaul, and you know, it's expensive. You spend billions and billions of dollars building networks, and then you have to recoup those costs from subscribers or users, right? So that's the simple model that I think everyone understands. We just knew that model wouldn't work. You know, one thing that was better about sensor applications is that you could create broad networks with less hardware. So it was less, from a physics point of view, was less complicated than a cellular network. Like one access point could create tens or hundreds of miles of network coverage. But it was still, you still needed hundreds or thousands, per city or geo area in order to create useful coverage. And that was a recurring problem that we kept running into. Like we had so many amazing conversations and interactions and pilots running with all of these companies, whether it was guys like Target or I remember the company that became Ring was called Doorbot. We're working with those guys for like a brief moment. And, we had all of these like interactions where it was like, this is a problem that should be solved and needs solving. But very quickly it became like, well, this isn't that useful unless the network is like everywhere. Otherwise it's kind of like Bluetooth, right? Like works when you're near your phone, but like I need it to work not when I'm near my phone. And so that was a problem that we just kept running into. And we tried all of these different tactics to like try and solve it. Like maybe we could build a network through users and through use cases, and that didn't really work. And then at some point in, I think it was 2017 era, like we had a few employees at the company that had dabbled in crypto, so one of our like head of BD, had invested in the Ethereum ICO, for example, right? And so like we knew something about it, but none of us were really taking it seriously, and I certainly wasn't. And then for me, it was really the Filecoin white paper was the first time that I was like, okay, here's a serious team that has built a functional protocol, like in IPFS, that is now looking at a way, in a similar way that we had, right? Like they had built IPFS and we had built this wireless network protocol, and they needed something else to like create adoption in a larger way. And so the Filecoin white paper was really the first time that I looked at something. I was like, okay, here's a team that is very competent, that knows exactly what they're trying to do, and is using crypto as an incentive to make that occur. Because up until then, everything was sort of financial applications or like, derivatives. And although that's interesting, it's not, was not applicable to what we were trying to do. So that was really the light bulb for us, was like, okay, here's Filecoin trying to like do in a sort of parallel plane what we need to do, which is like, how do you incentivize the growth of a protocol? And so for me, that was the first time I was like, okay, maybe there's something to this crypto thing beyond just, speculative financial applications.
Yeah, that 2017 era was a wild one, and the Wild West for sure. I think ultimately, I would say every bubble, whether it was kind of 2017 or 2021, has been great in the sense that it brings people in and allows you to kind of open your mind to some of the different possibilities of what is possible. And I personally kind of got more involved after the 2017 run up and kind of kept with it throughout the bear market. And I always say the people that stick around in the bear markets are and the ones that continue on after kind of these cycles that we go through are the ones that make huge strides.
Yeah, that era, the 2017, 2018 was like the ICO era, I like to think of it as. And, I think that was really, that was eye-opening in its own way for me, because it was like this view into this pent-up demand that retail had for like early access to like tech companies. That's the way I try to rationalize it to myself. And maybe it's not that complicated. Maybe people just like to gamble, but I like to think that it was more like, everyone was seeing IPOs, and by the time you get to an IPO, someone has already made 1,000x, 10,000x, depending on what the IPO is. And that was what I thought was interesting, was that this was a time where you had a mechanism that retail investors could participate early on in a tech company's like life cycle. And that's what I thought the ICO boom was. And I found that interesting too. It was like, this is an interesting way for the retail public to get early access to these companies. The problem was nearly all of them were a scam, right? And like it was just too easy money for people. And I don't think they could resist scamming people. And so there were a few that weren't that, obviously. And I think Filecoin was a good example of one that was in that period of time that was absolutely not one of those. But, yeah, I mean, it was like we sort of missed that phase, like the ICO boom happened. And by the time we were ready to do anything useful, that had all crashed and collapsed onto the ground. And, we were at the tail end. We were right at the start of the bear market, really, was when Helium came to be. And I remember, like news outlets, especially, like just wouldn't touch you with a 1,000-foot pole because they didn't want to feel like they were aiding and abetting some, crypto scam. So yeah, we're very comfortable in the bear market. Like we grew up in it to some degree, and I'm sure this won't be our last.
For sure. And in terms of, I mean, ultimately you talked about kind of watching Filecoin, seeing how they were using some of the token incentives to help their network and their platform grow. Can you talk a little bit more about, I mean, you saw what they were doing, you thought it was maybe applicable to what you were building at Helium. Could you kind of talk about the light bulb moment for you where that was maybe something that you wanted to introduce to help facilitate and help grow the network? Because I believe on on the DePIN side, I mean, you, Filecoin, were really kind of the pioneers of this category within crypto.
Yeah, I think the main thing that I took away from Filecoin was that they were the first time that I can remember, and maybe it isn't the first time, it's just the first time that I had seen it, where they had sort of devised a consensus protocol that was based on the thing that they wanted, right? Up until then, everything was sort of a proof of work clone. Like you had other file storage platforms like Sia or Sia. Don't know how you pronounce it. But that, they were a file storage network, but their consensus protocol and their Sybil resistance was proof of work. And I was like, that didn't make any sense to me, right? Like, why am I hashing, SHA-256 things if my mission is to like store files, right? Like we're unrelated tasks. And so Filecoin was for me at least the first time that I had seen a project or a team try and use the thing that they were trying to like solve for as the sort of mechanism for all of the consensus protocol. And so they had I think it was proof of space time, where basically they would reward miners on their platform for making storage available and for storing files. And that was really interesting to me. And that was kind of the light bulb moment for us, was like, okay, what if there was an equivalent of that where, you could reward people for proving that they were creating network coverage. That was the start. Like proof of coverage was really our light bulb moment, was like, is there a way for these hotspots, as we ended up calling them, to like send wireless packets into the air that were encrypted in some way? And if something else could receive them and decrypt them, then that was like proof that there was, a network there in the physical world. And, our first design had a million flaws and probably still does. But it was the first time, I think, that someone had tried to do something really in the physical world. Like Filecoin was kind of like that, but still really was a software implementation. Like it lived in data centers. And I think Helium was really the first time trying to like take that concept and apply it into a physical space. Which is, I think, now become called DePIN or TIPIN or whatever. But I think Helium really started that whole concept, which is very flattering. But that was it. Really, it was like, okay, let's try and devise a protocol that rewards people for doing the thing that we want. It's not proof of work. It's not proof of stake. It is, we want a wireless network to be created, and that's what we should reward people for doing. And so that was really the light bulb. And I think others have emulated or copied going forward the same sort of concept, which I think is awesome, by the way. I'm not sad about that. But that was really the thing, is like, how can we get people in the real world? How can we prove anything is happening in the real world? That was the hard part, still is the hard part.
Yeah. And again, I truly think you guys were pioneers in this entire category and kind of birthing it, as you mentioned, on kind of the physical side, which I would say is extremely impressive. And I think it's often kind of the simple, dumb ideas like incentivizing the actual behavior that you want to see happen that makes sense long term. And I think outside of just building crypto applications, the other part that crypto has continued to experiment on a grand scheme of things has been the tokenomics. And I think this new category, or the category that you've ultimately invented with kind of incentivizing the behavior that you want, that is now known as DePIN, has really, I think, makes the most sense out of all these categories. And I think that's probably evident with how many people kind of bought these hotspots, started to set them up. Could you talk a little bit about one, maybe in two buckets, kind of the hardware side of the business, going through the series of iterations that hardware you had to with the hardware, kind of those being a little bit slower from the software side of the things. And then second, how that ultimately transformed into people buying them and setting them up.
One thing that we felt very strongly about, and certainly I felt very strongly about, was that everything was too complicated at the time, right? So if you wanted to set up an Internet of Things gateway, we didn't invent the idea of like an Internet of Things gateway or anything. Like there was no magic in terms of the hardware or the technology as much as the sort of burning desire to make it easy to use. Like that was really the thing that we were so focused on, was how do we make customers like this and make it simple for them? Because up until that point, mining any kind of crypto was not a straightforward affair, right? Like you're either buying some very rudimentary hardware like an ant miner, or you're setting up some, something on your laptop, or none of that is mass market, right? Like that is power user, super user stuff. And that's okay. But we realized that in order for this to work, especially with a wireless network that needs broad geographic distribution, like pretty much anyone had to be able to set this up. It can't just be limited to like, experts. So we were focused on solving, how do we make it extremely easy for users to mine crypto and run an IoT gateway? Like that was what we were focused on. And so that's what we ended up building, was a device called a hotspot, that was an IoT gateway and a crypto miner combined into a single unit that was easy to use. And that was the only reason that we wanted to build the hardware. Was that we thought it was really important that it just had and none of it was like groundbreaking, but we thought for example, it should have a light that would tell you whether it's working or not, right? And it should have Bluetooth so that you could set it up with your phone, like any consumer electronics application. Like we viewed it from the consumer electronics lens rather than the crypto lens. And that was why we went down the path of building our own hardware, because everything else about it was really commodity, right? Inside it was a Raspberry Pi with a LoRa concentrator card, which did the wireless part. And so all of that stuff was available already, but it wasn't easy to set up. It wasn't easy to use. And I still see projects falling into this trap of it works, but it's still too complicated. And none of this is going to work in my mind unless the user experience is significantly better. And I'm talking about crypto broadly. And maybe that's just a perspective that I have from my video gaming days. But I think if it isn't easy to use, if like your parents can't set it up, then it's not going to work. That's my view.
I fully agree. And I think this is something that crypto is still struggling with. And in part, some people are building crypto for the crypto audience that has emerged. But I would argue, and I think you would probably agree, that audience is so small, and a few millions today. And ultimately, the internet is hundreds of millions and billions, hundreds of millions for single applications. So I think we all kind of want to get crypto in the blockchain industry to that level of scale. And to truly do that, as you mentioned, focusing on the user experiencing, really making it similar to what we have achieved in the level or in Web 2, I think is paramount. And I think many founders, maybe just within crypto, because they are younger, it's kind of a newer field, there's less barrier to entry, haven't kind of learned these lessons. But I truly appreciate speaking to people such as yourself that have that extra focus on the consumer side, because it is truly lacking.
Yeah, it's I think it's easy to get caught up in your own bubbles. Like if you, especially with things like Twitter, and you can really create powerful like echo chambers that I think really reinforce your existing point of view. And whether that's in politics or whether that's in crypto or that doesn't really matter. And I think it's a very dangerous phenomenon, because you can easily get to the point where you think everyone understands why an NFT exists, or why some crypto derivative application makes sense. But it's one of those things where if you can't really explain it to like a 5-year-old, then you either don't understand it or it's not real. And I think you're kind of seeing that with NFTs happening like in real time right now, where I think NFTs, there's an application space that is, in my mind, extremely valuable in the NFT world. And, there's some thought leaders there, like, I forget his number, Punk6529, I think, who is,
Yep.
Like someone that I follow, who I think has a very deep understanding of why this technology is valuable. But then you've got the other guys trading, monkey pictures for like $1 million, and there's a big gap there as to like why that's happening, and like what's the point of that, and like why does it make sense to anyone? And it's very difficult, I think, to like consolidate that if your whole universe is people that think the same way as you, right? You can easily believe that this all makes sense until it doesn't. So that's just one thing. And I think Helium did this very well, and a lot of it was marketing. Like we did very traditional, boring, lame marketing. Like we did Facebook ads, we did Instagram ads. Like we did things, and they're very hard, right? Because it takes a lot of iteration, it costs a lot of money. You don't know what's going to work, and you have to sort of religiously like look at whether things are working or not, whether you like it or not. Like a lot of the ads that were most successful for us, I thought were god awful. Like I hated, like I would cringe every time I looked at them. And I would have these arguments with Frank, our COO, and he'd be like, "It doesn't matter what you think, because these are the ones that convert the best," right? And so that's really hard. Like it's a very difficult, mindset to be in, where it's not just like, I think it's cool. It's like, does this work or not? Like, does this reach an audience? Like, do they respond to it? Do they react to it? And that's boring work. That is constant iteration of messaging and graphics and language and everything, right? And I understand why people don't want to do that or don't think of it that way, because it's not exciting or fun in the same way as building, a cool piece of technology.
Yeah, but I also think that just kind of speaks to your experience in following the data and following the analytics as much as, or sometimes it can be painful, but kind of sticking to your guns on that point. I think, the Facebook and kind of traditional Web2 ads obviously worked. I think there was numerous kind of, whether YouTube, Twitter, people clamoring to get your hardware to set up one of the hotspots to facilitate the networks to start earning tokens. Can you talk about kind of that journey, that where you started distributing these to where the network is today, and kind of some of the analytics on the hotspots and coverage?
It's hard to imagine, honestly, that it got so big. One of the very difficult things when you're manufacturing hardware is inventory management. Like you don't know how many to manufacture, for example, right? Like the worst nightmare, I think, for every hardware company, whether it is Apple or, Helium, is having too much hardware sitting on a shelf. And that's very difficult. And so in a weird way, it caused the success of Helium, that we didn't know how to plan properly is part of what caused Helium to work. It was completely unintentional. I think we did a very good job with all the things that I described, like user experience and making it easy and making it pretty and making it fun. That's just table stakes as far as I'm concerned. But part of what caused Helium to get popular was scarcity of hardware, and that was not intentional. We manufactured 3,000 hotspots ourselves at the start. It was very expensive for us to do it. We did it all in the States. We lost money on everything on the hardware side. And then it took a long time for us to sell those 3,000. It's hard to sort of think about it now, or maybe it's easier to think about it now because we're in a bear market again. But, selling the first 3,000 was really difficult. We had one day where we sold 150 and we were really happy about that. But typical day was single digits, and it was really a struggle. Because again, crypto was toxic because of the ICO stuff. We both didn't want to, and from a regulatory point of view, shouldn't talk about profit and token, making money. And that's not the way we ever wanted to position ourselves. But it made it difficult to explain what this was, what was the benefit or what was the incentive. It's you earn this token, but the token isn't on any exchanges and it doesn't have any value. And so, how do you explain all of that? How do you get started given that reality? So it was really difficult. It just took it was just work. It took a lot of work, and it took a lot of spending time with the community that was forming. I spent thousands of hours in Discord and Slack before that, just interacting with the community, and I still do. And a lot of that was just answering questions and sort of trying to educate what we were trying to do. And I think that was super important that I spent that time, or that we collectively spent that time doing that. And then after that, we finally sold the first 3,000. We made another batch of, I think, 20,000. And somewhere in there, it all took off. There started to be serious demand. And again, we only had 20,000 units. COVID was kind of happening. Supply chains were slowing down. And that demand is what really was a big factor in the success of Helium. There was demand and there was no supply. And we didn't plan it this way. It wasn't intentional. We started to shift out. We wanted to sort of decentralize away from us as quickly as we could. And so we had third parties that were starting to build hotspots, but they also had supply chain problems, and so it was part of the success was that people were looking from the outside in and seeing this thing growing. And we're I want to be part of this thing, but I can't. All I can do is join this wait list. And so, but again, it was an interesting lesson learned that I wouldn't want to manipulate that way or encourage anyone to manipulate that way. But I think there is definitely something to be said about the sort of LA nightclub, or maybe the Miami nightclub. You're in Miami, where you see a long line outside the club and you want to get in there and you can't get in there. And it's, and there's something human naturey about that desire to be part of something that seems to be cool that's happening and you're not in it. That I think drove Helium to succeed, and perhaps drove a lot of other crypto projects to get big. Is a lot of that, outside looking in. But yeah, none of us expected it to take off the way it did. We obviously were optimistic about the fact that it would work, but did we expect it to get to 1 million hotspots in, 18, 24 months? Like, no, not at all. Not even close.
No, I do agree. I think can't remember which book I read, but they kind of described the phenomena as like the red velvet ropes, and just the hype that creates by people kind of walking outside and seeing that no one else is kind of allowed to enter. But I do agree. I mean, into now being at 1 million hotspots, I think ultimately all of the tech is cool. I mean, the blockchain component kind of helps bootstrap the network. You have then built out 1 million hotspots kind of worldwide, and the tokenomics ultimately helped aid in creating the supply. Can you talk about now kind of the demand and the demand component for the network, how you kind of see that growing over time, and where you would like it to be in the future?
Demand we always knew was going to be high latency, and by that I mean it was going to come much later than the network build out, and maybe this was an area where we didn't do a good enough job of expectation setting for that community and for the greater audience. Like I think about this a lot. For me, it was like extremely obvious that this was the way it was going to go, but for others, and certainly a lot of the critics, it was a sign of failure, right? And the reason that it was obvious to me that it was going to take a long time was that we used this wireless protocol called LoRaWAN. No one in the general world is ever going to have heard of it, and probably never will hear of it. And it was, it had been around for a long time. This company called Semtech was responsible for building it. I think they're based in San Jose. And there wasn't, a ton of adoption. It was well known as being a very good piece of technology, like at very long range. Like you could run a sensor like underground and it would still work. But it hadn't succeeded in my mind because there wasn't really a big network that enabled it to exist. Like if you wanted to use LoRaWAN, you had to go build your own network. So if I'm a company that wants, to monitor like floods or something, I have to go build, the wireless coverage for those sensors. So the theory there was that if we caused the network to exist, that applications would sort of come along. And there's lots of examples of like where that had been true, whether it was Bluetooth or Wi-Fi or, even TCP/IP itself. We thought that logic made sense. But because of hardware, at least to me, it was obvious that this was going to take a really long time to get adopted, right? So if you think about from the moment that someone says, I'm going to build a sensor, it is probably like a 3 to 5 year journey before that thing really gets to market in a meaningful way. I'm not talking about a prototype or like something that just works. I'm talking about hundreds of thousands or more being distributed and being sold, and all of the logistics and regulation and manufacturing and everything that comes along with doing things at scale. And so to me, it was always a thing in my head where there was going to be some moment in time where the network was big enough to be viable to be used, and not just big enough, but had the reputation of actually working. Because at the first, everything's broken. I mean, like it's just the reality, right? Like it takes a lot of time for something to become mature and stable. And so there was always going to be some time where like it was stable enough and big enough. And to me, that was like sort of ground zero. And then it was going to be 5+ years after that until there was like serious adoption. And I think that's the stage that we're in now, is that the network got big enough and useful enough, probably somewhere in 2021. And from then, it's going to take years until you see large scale applications that take advantage of a network like this. And I think having crypto involved creates a ton of skepticism. Like people viewed this network as a scam or not real or a Ponzi or like whatever word you want. And that sort of tarnishes, like if you're a company or an individual or a startup or whatever, thinking about building a sensor application, like, am I going to risk it? Right? Like, am I going to risk building my application dependent on a Ponzi or a scam or whatever? Right. And so you kind of have to get through that whole notion of risk before people really start building things and taking advantage of the network and scale. And that's very different from something like a cellular network, like you see with Helium 5G, where the applications are already there and you're trying to convince people to like switch basically, or you're trying to give people incentive or motivation to use a different network. The IoT network is not like that. It's not like there was 100 million sensors somewhere and we just had to convince them to come use Helium. It's like none of these sensors really existed and they still don't really exist. And so it's a very different problem. But I know that for the average person and for especially for a critic that wants to ignore that, it it's not obvious, right? Like it's not an obvious thing that there is that lag time, that there aren't just 100 million sensors there that you just flip over one day. And people would be like, well, the network's so big, why is no one using it? Why are there millions of devices? And I'm like, well, where would they have come from, right? Like where would those millions have emerged from? Because they would have had to start being built, 3, 4, 5 years ago. And that wasn't going to happen when the network, was 100 hotspots or whatever. So very chicken egg problem, requires a ton of patience. And I get why that's difficult. Like it's a difficult problem. And I don't know that we did a great job of setting the expectation well there.
Yeah. And the money aspect that kind of crypto more broadly just introduced into, whether it's yours, other decentralized physical infrastructure networks, just other applications in general, does make it a little bit complex. But I think particularly within the decentralized physical infrastructure space, you are building a network, and the token is kind of one component just to help facilitate building that network out, but you're still building something that needs kind of sufficient coverage. I actually did a podcast with the Hivemapper CEO, Ariel, and he was talking about how mapping data is not super useful until you have, say, like 80-90% coverage. Once you're at 50%, map data is not super great. You really want to have high coverage. Can you talk about, kind of what has been that tipping point, or where do you feel like you'll get to that tipping point from the Helium standpoint, where you feel like there's significant coverage? Now it's just pushing forward on the application or sensor front, as you mentioned.
On the IoT network, I think the network got there, like I said, probably somewhere in like late 2021, like where there was so much coverage that was no longer the problem. And I like to think of it as like layers of problems, right? Like they're at the top of it is like, if you think of a cake, like at the top is like the finished product. And there's just all these layers that have to exist in order for that to be possible at the top. And coverage was certainly one of those, right? And then it wasn't really until 2021 until that was good enough. Others were things like stability and performance and, and like I said, perception is really a big problem. Like the perception of crypto is still not where it should be, and having any association with it, especially in sort of the business to business, like enterprise universe, it just creates a ton of skepticism. Like their natural inclination is that this isn't going to work, or that this is a scam or whatever. And it takes a lot of momentum to get through that. So similar to what Ariel was talking about with Hivemapper, I'm on the board of Hivemapper, by the way, just for full disclosure. They have the similar kind of thing, right? Where someone looking to buy that kind of mapping data, whether it's Google Maps or Apple Maps or, whoever might be on the back end as a purchaser, it's probably not valuable until some tipping point. And the challenge is that you've got to motivate a community to like go do all of this in the meantime, right? And like there has to be enough positive momentum. And unfortunately in crypto, like a lot of that just means price, and that is completely out of your control. And it's difficult, I think, for people to be patient and believe in things in the long term. And I get why, right? Like people, for people purchasing a hotspot, it can be a lot of money for them. And it can be a lot of risk for them. And I think that's where crypto and like long-term alignment are at odds with each other a lot of the time, right? It's still too kind of instant profit driven. And I think a lot of the YouTube stuff that happened around Helium, honestly, probably didn't really help. Like the guys posting that they made $5,000 a day or something. No one should expect that it's realistic to plug a box in that costs, $400 or $500 and earn $5,000 a day. It just doesn't make any sense. Like it doesn't, but just someone seeing that, they don't really care if it makes sense or not. They just want to get in on it. Right. And so there's a little bit of a misalignment that I think is a challenge. And especially when your objective is very long term. Like for me, this has always been something that would take 5, 10, 15 years. And for someone buying a hotspot, like they want ROI in like, a week or something like that, or it's a failure. And so those are at odds with each other. And I think we were very deliberate about staying away from anything to do with ROI and earning I still don't want to go anywhere near it, but I understand why that tension exists. But I do think it's a difficult one. And you'll see more and more projects, I think, run into that hardship where their objective is a very big and long one, and the objective of their participants is much shorter.
And do you feel like that's strictly just a communication thing that people will have to get over, or is there a way to, going back to kind of incentivization with tokens, to bake that into the underlying protocol?
It's a really good question, actually. I think the way Hivemapper is doing it, I think is smarter than the way Helium did it. And perhaps because there were, hopefully because there were lessons learned from watching what we did. But we did the Bitcoin thing, right? Where the token model was heavily front loaded, right? Like the earliest participants, earned a ton of the total supply relative to like future participants. And on the one hand, that obviously worked. On the other hand, it created a lot of dissatisfaction for later participants, right? Who got in late, and especially with some of the supply chain issues, it took years in some cases for people to receive hardware that they had purchased, not from us, but from some of the third parties in the ecosystem. And it's hard to say. Like I say, maybe it worked, but it certainly were a lot of people that were unhappy with their earnings relative to the expectation. And I don't know how much it is on the sort of founding team to like set the expectations versus how much that is sort of out of your control. I mean, like we can't stop people posting the YouTube video of earning $5,000 a day. And so, yeah, it's a tough one. And I think the way Hivemapper is trying to do it is the sort of tokenomic model is more in line with the size of the network rather than time, which I think is, I don't know if that's going to work. It seems to be working for them, but it's a very interesting model, and I'm glad they're trying it, where rather than being rewarded for just being early, there's kind of this model where as the network size changes, that sort of dictates the token emission schedule. So I'm really glad to see someone trying a different model rather than just sort of copying what Helium did, which is a lot of what I see elsewhere.
Yeah, I think, as always, I mean, you guys were the first. You pioneered kind of this entire category. There was a lot of learning lessons, I'm sure, and teams will kind of take what worked, what they think they may need to iterate on, and continue to grow. So no, it's all fascinating. I mean, I think with crypto, the space is entirely still in its infancy, and we're learning as we go. We're trying kind of these different experiments and continuing to iterate. And I think maybe to that point, I mean, you guys have continued to roll out. You've mentioned kind of the 5G network. Can you speak on that just a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, one of the important things that happened, and just sort of a point of clarity, is that I can't remember at what point this happened, but a Helium Foundation formed in, I think, probably 2020, and took over a lot of the responsibility of like building, or assumed a lot of the responsibility of building the network and the governance related to it. And we, as Nova Labs, became very focused on like how do we run a business that like sits on top of all of this. The 5G network, I think, is very exciting in a very different way to the IoT network. Like it's exciting because a hotspot deployer may also be the user of the hotspot. And that's a very different model than with IoT, where you're sort of building a network and some other entity somewhere may or may not end up using it, right? And it's probably an industrial application or a business to business type use case. Whereas with 5G, you hope that the consumers of your hotspot are like your neighbors and your friends, and like, it's very different and it's very visceral when, you put a hotspot up and then you use your phone and you can actually like use it. It's very different feeling. There's a lot of differences in those two networks. The range of the hotspots in the 5G network is tiny in comparison with the IoT network. And that creates its own universe of challenges, right? That there needs to be a much greater focus on precision of the deployment, right? Like it is not useful to just put a hotspot somewhere, right? Like in my mind, like the somewhere needs to be an area where there are going to be subscribers, or there are going to be a high density of like slow moving people, as we like to call them, right? Like people that are walking around on phones or sitting in a coffee shop or whatever. And so the model for the deployment of the Helium 5G network needs to be very, very different from the IoT network. And up until now, it hasn't really been. Like, it's sort of been deployed roughly the same way, where people just put hardware wherever they want to put it. But that's changing. You know, there's a process in the Helium community called the HIP process, which is the Helium Improvement Proposal. And the community is very, very active in proposing things all the time. I think we just went through our 90th HIP in the Helium community. And some of them are very substantial changes to the way the network works. And a lot of what's going on in the 5G network community right now is around precision of deployment. Like, how can we incentivize deployments in the right places? How can we put some limits on how many hotspots can be in one place, for example? So a lot of lessons that were learned from the IoT network are being applied in the 5G network, but physics are very different because of the range. The cost of the hardware is very different because of the complexity of cellular. We are doing some things to like try and improve that and bring the cost down. But, you know, one thing that's, I think, interesting about Helium and is used against the network a lot is that things move quite slowly. And part of that is because it's like truly a decentralized application at this point, like, it truly is. There are proposals that get voted on that we as Nova Labs like wildly disagree with. And that's good, you know, but it causes things to move quite slowly because there's a truly like democratic process in place. And at times that's very frustrating. Like, you wish like you could just change it, or like one company just like does the thing. But I'm like, I've been fascinated to watch this like decentralized governance process like evolve with Helium. And I think the 5G network is taking advantage of that, because there's a lot of participants that are very vocal and very active about wanting to change things, to like learn some of the lessons that we learned in IoT, where, you know, sort of spray and pray approach of deployment, especially given the shorter range, is just not going to work. And so, like, how can we change that, and how do we improve that as sort of participants in the network, which I think is awesome.
In kind of the end state that the Helium network is ultimately striving for is kind of 5G rolled out in every city, kind of as global coverage. Where do you think like this ends up?
So we started Nova Labs. We started a subscriber product called Helium Mobile. So we licensed the name Helium from the foundation, and it's like a direct to subscriber, direct to consumer product where you can subscribe to Helium Mobile and use a combination of T-Mobile. We did this deal with T-Mobile and the Helium network. So a very novel approach where I'm a subscriber and I have a SIM card or an eSIM, and sometimes I'm using the Helium network and sometimes I'm using the T-Mobile network, and I don't really know or care about whether I'm on either. And so as a result of that, that was, again, coming from like some of the learning from the IoT network, was that especially in the early stages, like someone has to like push it towards adoption, right? Like in the IoT network, we very much took this approach with like, we're not going to build the applications. We're going to let someone else do that, right? Like our responsibility is the infrastructure. And I think that's fine, but it just means that the applications take a lot longer to develop. Again, because you've got skepticism, for example, right? Like companies are not going to just jump on board and start building applications on this network that's just forming. And so with the 5G network, we decided that we were going to like launch a direct to subscriber, direct to consumer product. So getting this deal done with T-Mobile was very important because the network is too small at the start for a consumer to really use it without a backstop. So we are going to be very active in attempting to like incentivize the community to build hotspot coverage where we find it to be the most useful. And we're going to use tokens to do that. We're going to be very public about data consumption for our subscribers, right? So where data is being used the most, where it would be the most beneficial for hotspots to be deployed. And it's a very different approach than the IoT network because it's going to be data driven first, right? Where we have subscribers here, and if you put a hotspot here, you're going to earn, tokens as a result of them using those hotspots. Is the inverse model from the IoT network. And so it's going to be fascinating to watch. There's been a lot of improvement proposals that have gone through that allow us as Helium Mobile to do things like stake tokens in specific areas and say like, hey, if you put a hotspot here, you're going to earn more because we are like boosting it as we call it. And so we hope that model works, I guess. And there's no other way to say it. Like, this is all new, and we are experimenting with, can we incentivize the behavior of hotspot deployers to take advantage of subscribers that we're going to go and acquire? And luckily, we're well capitalized to go do that. But it's a high risk, very big gamble to try and deploy a model like this. And so we'll see how it goes, I guess.
Yeah, no, it is fascinating. And I think having kind of that initial partnership with T-Mobile is crucial, as you mentioned, kind of building out the 5G infrastructure to get to a point where it's robust enough where you're using predominantly the Helium network. To that point, you were kind of talking about the Helium improvement proposals. A couple that I specifically wanted to talk about was Helium Improvement Proposal 51 and 70. And I think 51 was kind of, you did a variety of things. One of those being kind of splitting up some of the tokenomics. And then with Helium Improvement Proposal 70, you decided to change from building your own kind of infrastructure on the blockchain side to migrating to Solana. Could you maybe speak to each of those just briefly, what you think has worked well or things that maybe didn't go as well as you expected?
Yeah, so the cool thing about HIP 51 is that we didn't write it. And again, this is like one of those great examples of the community sort of coming up with this thing. And, so when we started the Helium network, it wasn't really possible to build out a cellular network for a bunch of different reasons. The first one really was that there wasn't any unlicensed spectrum available that you could use. And that changed over the years with something called CBRS. So when we wrote the first white paper, we were keenly aware that if this worked, we would want to try and do it with other types of network as well. And over time, that became more and more obvious that should occur. So this company called FreedomFi that we ended up acquiring kind of really brought the idea of the 5G network to Helium. Like, they were trying to build out an open source cellular network, and they had seen what Helium had achieved with the IoT network and how big that had gotten, and wondered whether they could apply the same model to their 5G network. And that's kind of where HIP 51 was born from, was like, okay, here's a company actually doing the thing. And the question is, what do you do, right? Like, you've got one token, and do you want to sort of dilute it that way, right? Like, do you want token earnings to go to both 5G network deployers and IoT network deployers? Like, how do you create that split? Like, what do you do about the fact that the economics in the 5G network need to be very different from the IoT network? Like, the cost per gigabyte, for example, is much cheaper in the 5G network. And so there were all of these governance and technology questions that were unclear, like how you would address them. And so HIP 51 was this proposal to, instead of it being this monolithic network, to try and create these this network of networks, basically, where each type of network had its own governance, it had its own token, it had its own everything, basically. And how would that all work? How would it all roll up into the big Helium? Because what you didn't want to do was kind of punish one network for the behavior of the other. And so you wanted to create this way where the sort of rising tide lifts all boats, or whatever cliche you want to come up with, where if anything succeeded, it caused everyone to succeed. And so HIP 51 was basically there should be different tokens for each network, but in order to use each network, you still had to use HNT, which was the main token. And so that was sort of the rough concept. I think in general, it's worked pretty well. I think it's been confusing for a lot of people. Like, all of a sudden they're earning an IoT token instead of HNT, or they're earning mobile instead of HNT. And I think that's been confusing. It's been a difficult one to message and explain, even though I think the foundation did a great job consistently messaging this over time. Like, people would still show up and be shocked, that there was a new token, even though it had been talked about for 2 years. So that's interesting too. It's how do you reach your audience? How do you explain things to them, especially when it's this big? And then HIP 70 was kind of a separate proposal that we wrote, which was, rather than continue to use our bespoke L1 blockchain that we had built, why not, now that something like Solana existed, why not do it there, right? It would alleviate an enormous amount of engineering burden, sort of building and maintaining this thing. it would open access to like a bigger ecosystem, whether that was for like DeFi or NFTs or like just general access to like sort of programmability and composability. We thought was important. And so we proposed HIP 70. It was sort of two parts. Part of it was separating the on-chain and off-chain architecture. And the other part was specifically which L1 to use. And that part was the most controversial by far. As you know, like, as I'm sure most of the audience listening will know, like L1 communities are very tribal. You know, it's like very little of it is based in logic, and a lot of it is just based in like, you know, bag holding and sort of tribal knowledge. And so, I mean, we could have chosen any block. It almost didn't matter. I think Ethereum still would have been the most difficult, just from a cost point of view, just because, again, the transactions are quite expensive. We went for Solana for a whole bunch of reasons. At least we proposed Solana for a bunch of reasons. Speed, cost, the fact that we knew the founding team very well was rightly or wrongly quite important to us. And there were lots of other sub factors. The fact that they used the same elliptic curve cryptography meant that it was easy for us to migrate the entire ledger from one place to another without needing everyone's private keys or needing a migration process. So there were a lot of factors, and I think there was a pretty good blog post that laid out, you know, all those factors, but it didn't really matter. Like, people still complained and abandoned the project because of Solana, and like they can't trust it and they can't use it, can't believe they would pick a chain that went down every 3 days. And, you know, so just a lot of hyperbole and a lot of nonsense. But we knew that was going to happen.
Yeah. Crypto is funny for how much tribalism actually exists. And I think, again, it's just so early that I think everybody is excited about the possibilities and where the future could be. And so I think almost it's kind of a land grab from the community perspective that they want their shiny thing or their bags to be chosen. And if it's not their bags, it's a declaration of war against kind of that community, which I think is unfortunate.
Yeah, it's very much the case. I mean, I think people assume that I owned a ton of like Sol tokens. I think I have something like 3 Sol, maybe less, and I only use it for fees. So, I mean, we really didn't care. I still don't care to some degree. Like, I think Solana is an amazing piece of technology. But for us, it was very utilitarian. Like, our objective was we want to stop dealing with our old L1, and we want to put it somewhere else. And where that is, I quite honestly couldn't care less. And I think we just sort of laid out the factors that we used for our decision making and let people vote on it. But it's exactly as you said. It became very, very, very toxic at times, for sure.
Yeah. It is a funny topic. I mean, on the topic of, I mean, toxic, I mean, we've kind of talked about this throughout the podcast, but the hardships of communicating kind of something new, novel, something that is more trying to think about the long term, build the infrastructure to kind of facilitate these, and kind of maybe the misunderstanding between some of the community members and what Foundation or Nova has ultimately put out, whether that's from like popular YouTubers or to just the economics of the platform. Maybe if you were to kind of communicate or want individuals to take one thing from the podcast, whether in regards to like the FUD or kind of something that is up and coming with Helium, what would that be?
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a tough one. You know, I think one of the lessons that I had actually learned in a prior startup and just sort of failed to like implement was that, especially when you're dealing with new things, if you don't define the metrics for success well, then someone else will, basically, right? And Helium was very much a victim of that in terms of the negative publicity that it got. Like, there was a period of time where like anyone in the tech media seemed to be talking about was Helium. And that was a first for me, because usually when you're at a startup, you're like begging for attention. You're like, look, I'm doing this super cool thing. Like, come write about us. And it was the first time that people were writing about us and we didn't want them to. And, you know, big people like Forbes and Fortune and like guys like that were all taking shots at us. And I think some of it was our fault in the sense that we didn't create enough of a definition of what it meant for the network to be successful or not. And some of it was that, and some of it was like maybe we got the economics wrong. So for example, using the network if you're operating a sensor is extraordinarily cheap. Like it's fractions of a penny to send a piece of data. And so what you ended up with was this situation where the network today is moving billions and billions of censored packets every single year. In some cases, like tens of millions a day. But in dollar terms, that's like not very much money. Like in a lot of cases, like you might only see $100 worth of value or in a day. And so what really started it off was that, right? Was that people looked at it, it's like this network is valued at $1 billion or whatever, and it's only generating, $1,000 or $6,000 a month worth of usage or something like that. And so there's this massive discrepancy between a thing that's worth $1 billion and, monthly revenue of $6,000. And that became very frustrating for us because but it was frustration that I think we caused. So firstly, it was like the difference between the company and the network was one thing, right? So like a lot of the articles were like Helium/Nova has raised, hundreds of millions of dollars, is valued at $1 billion, yet only generates $6,000 a month worth of revenue. It's like, we don't generate that revenue. That's like network revenue. It's like nothing to do with the company. So there were two separate entities, and that was one source of frustration. The other was like looking at the dollar value of like usage rather than the sort of trend of usage, right? Like $6,000 a month. I don't think anyone is going to look at that and be impressed. But looking at tens or hundreds of millions of like packets of data being moved on a newly built network that was sort of incentivized via crypto, that's incredible. Like I continue to be like amazed that occurs. But again, like we didn't really define what that meant or like what we thought was successful or not. And so it allowed this narrative to like kind of run away, basically, right? Where usage was like so low and blah, blah, blah. But I think crypto in general suffers from this. Like if I look at some of the biggest market cap projects like Cardano or XRP, if you were going to look at the like fee usage of those projects relative to their market cap, doesn't make any sense, right? Like I don't know what the market cap of Cardano is these days, but $5-10 billion and fee usage of like thousands of dollars, it doesn't make any sense. And so none of it makes sense, but it's also not our fault, right? Like we didn't value the network at $1 billion. Like that wasn't our doing. So it's there's a lot to learn there in the crypto space in general. Like we were sort of a victim of our own success. But it was really as a result of failing to define what we thought success looked like, putting those metrics front and center, talking really about the use cases and the applications that this was enabling rather than the dollar value. And it might still be that using the Helium IoT network is 10 times too cheap or 100 times too cheap or 1,000 times too cheap. I don't know. Like it's possible that we got that wrong because we kind of just made the number up. Like we didn't know either at the start. We just picked a number out of thin air. And so, yeah, a lot to be learned there. And I do think a lot of the criticism was some combination of like wanting to hate crypto, trying to find anything wrong. I still to this day think we did one of the fairest launches in terms of like how the token was emitted and how much of it went to the founders and investors. Like, I don't think anyone has done that better than us. But it became a point of criticism in like, a Forbes article where, we had mined all of the suppliers and all of it was bullshit. And I think perhaps we should have responded more forcefully. So definitely a lot of lessons there. Like any narrative can be spun, regardless of what you do, and getting ahead of it and how you respond to it, I think is super important. And I certainly learned a lot from that, even though we were on the receiving end of it in a very negative way.
So maybe to re-articulate, defining your own success is extremely important, and also just making sure that you communicate kind of the narrative and what your objectives are.
Yeah, and that gets harder as it gets bigger. It sort of runs away from you. Like there are so many manufacturers, there are so many things talking about helium, like you can't control it at some point, right? And so I think in the early stages, sort of defining all of that is even more critical because it just gets amplified more and more and more as it gets further away from you. So on the one hand, it's a sign of great success, like helium is truly decentralized. On the other hand, it's a source of great frustration because you can't control all the narratives and all the things that you want, even if they're not your fault or nothing to do with you. They just, they get attributed to you. And so Yeah, a lot to learn there, and a lot of things that you would do differently in hindsight for sure. But that's not the way this works.
Maybe last question as we kind of wrap it up, towards either 2023 or 2024, what big milestones or what things are you kind of looking forward to, whether in Helium, the world, the blockchain industry as a whole?
For Helium Mobile, I am very excited to launch out of beta. Like, we've been in this invite only beta phase for the last month or two. It's been generally going quite well, and a lot of it was just us needing to learn. For example, how do we do support? How do we do customer support for a cell phone subscriber? And it's complex because some of the issues are with T-Mobile and some of them are with us. And so how do we do that escalation, and how do we? There was a lot of stuff that we felt like we needed to learn beyond the technology. But I'm really excited for Helium Mobile to launch out of beta. There's so much stuff that we want to announce that we have ready that I think is going to be exciting and to some degree shocking for the industry. And I'm really excited to get there. We have an IoT division called 1663 that's working with a lot of big companies building IoT products. So I'm really excited to talk about those. But that was one of the lessons we learned: don't talk about them too early. So we're gonna wait until those are
alpha to drop today.
fully baked before I even say a word about that this time. And then I'm excited for Helium to grow. I mean, it's now not anything to do with us in terms of how it grows and how it evolves. That alone is very exciting, and I'm excited to see what happens and where it all evolves. In the crypto industry in general, I'm optimistic that you get more Helium Filecoin like things, less NFTs that don't seem to do anything, and less derivative financial applications that don't really do anything. I think DeFi is an incredible invention, by the way, and I think NFTs are an incredible invention as well. I just don't think they've been applied in the most useful way yet. And so I'm excited to see those sort of evolve into their future form, whether that's for concert tickets as NFTs, or whether that's, really banking the unbanked, as I think was sort of really the promise of crypto. I really want to see that come to fruition. And most of the NFT projects I see, I'm just I don't understand, what is the purpose here? Sure, the art is cool, but is there some other thing that I'm missing here that I don't get? And I think the answer is no. There isn't anything I'm missing yet, but I'm excited to see, where people take that kind of stuff. And I think the primitives exist now, with the various L1s and the various ideas and the various technologies that are out there, whether it's zero knowledge proofs or whatever else. There's some really, really amazing base level primitives that now I think allow this stuff to get built. So I'm excited to watch that.
Lovely put. Well, we'll end it there. I greatly appreciate your time. It was a lot of fun chatting on the podcast, kind of hearing your story as an entrepreneur, the journey of Helium, the foundation, what ultimately now Nova is doing, how that's all kind of coming together, the lessons learned along the way, fighting the FUD. But truly wish you and the team the most success. Really excited for what you guys are building.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. It was great.